I'm on a mission like a couple spies, and that, guys, is the reason why I catechize.
Welcome to the Reformed Standard. I'm Tony. Let's get started. Question 26 of the Westminster Larger Catechism. How is original sin conveyed from our first parents unto their posterity? Answer. Original sin is conveyed from our first parents unto their posterity by natural generation, so as all that proceed from them in that way are conceived and born in sin. So this is an interesting question, and it's one that I think relies on a little bit of speculation, but I don't think it's too much speculation. And so the basic idea is that the divines observe from Scripture that original sin is transmitted or is communicated from parents to children. And so they're sort of forced to wrestle with or to grapple with how that can be. How is that done? And the Scripture doesn't give us a lot of answers, but they do cite a couple interesting proof texts that I just want to touch on. So they cite Job 14:4, which in their translation here says, "Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Not one." And then they also cite John 3:6, which states that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. And so the theology that they're communicating here is basically that like begets like. And so if you have sinful parents, those sinful parents beget sinful children. And now this is a question that goes way back in Christian theology, all the way back to at least Augustine, if not earlier. We don't see a lot of discussion on it earlier, but Augustine is one of the first people who really develops a robust, comprehensive understanding of original sin, and he does that in response to the Pelagian controversy. So he's not the first person to develop it or to talk about it, but he's kind of the first person to really articulate it. And so Augustine, reflecting on this question, basically argued that the act of procreation, the sexual act of procreation, involves lust. It involves sin, even though sex in itself is not sinful. It still involves, generally speaking, it involves the lust. In his view, is the lust of the father. Now, there's probably some psychological reasons why he went that direction with his own life and background, but procreation involves the lust of the parents, especially the father. And so his theory was that because the procreative act involved lust and sin necessarily, that it sort of passed on original sin or concupiscence into the offspring of that union. And so that's one of the theories, but the divines here don't go into the specifics. So that's why I say it's a little bit speculative, but it's not as speculative as some other answers. So their answer is more or less, we don't necessarily know the exact how, but we know that it happens. And so it's passed somehow through natural generation. So anytime two parents who are affected by the effects of the fall, anytime two people come together and procreate an offspring, that natural union results in the transmission of original sin. Now, the divines, I don't believe, get into questions about, traducianism versus creationism in terms of the origin of the soul. Those questions are not as specifically called out here. But what is called out and what's specified is that all of those who descend by ordinary generation from one generation to the next, by natural generation, original sin is transmitted. And so we saw that same thing when we talked about the covenant, right? That Adam, not only for himself, but also for his posterity, all descending from him by ordinary generation, sinned in him and fell with him. So it's not necessarily the case that this is a sort of a biological transmission or even some sort of like spiritual heritage or spiritual descendancy. All this is saying, if we follow the logic from the previous question on the covenant, on the fall, is that because of the nature of the covenant of works, because of that nature, which was in some senses unified, Adam was our public representative because he was our biological head, that covenantally original sin is also passed on, right? So we've talked so far about the sort of the ethical or the legal dimensions of the fall. We're going to get into the sort of existential dimensions of the fall, but both of those dimensions are passed down through ordinary biological descent. Even though it's probably not the case that there's something mechanical in the biological descent, it is still the case that the biological descent is what causes the transmission of original sin. So that will become very important later as we understand that the reason that Christ is preserved from original sin is not, as the Roman Catholics believe, because Mary was somehow sinless and so she didn't transmit it. And since he didn't have a human father, there was no lust involved in the conception. Instead, what we recognize is that Christ is not descended from Adam by ordinary natural biological descent. And so this succession of descent is broken in the virginal conception of Christ. So it's important, the virgin conception is important for the sinlessness of Christ, but not for the reasons or the way that the Roman Catholic Church explains. Because what it does is it sort of breaks up the covenant transmission of original sin. And so Christ still comes under the law. He's still born under the law, but he's born under the law in a different sense and in a different relationship to that law. And that becomes important. So this question is about more than just how does sin transmit from generation to generation, but it also sets up the theology of the incarnation that we're going to see coming up in a little bit here.
Do you know, if you want, you could know this? The Catechism, hey, the Catechism, hey. Do you know what the chief and the man is? And how the Father, Son, and Spirit do manage? Do you know, if you want, you could know?
West Side.